One of my favorite public haunted places in Toronto, Canada, is a museum called the Mackenzie House, but the people who work there don't seem to enjoy it as much as casual visitors do. In fact, the people who take care of the place often find it pretty scary. The house was once the home of William Mackenzie, who was at one time the mayor of Toronto, but he made so many enemies for that time. He had to flee Canada and take refuge in the United States. Now that he is safely dead, he seems to have returned to his Toronto home. Some caretakers have seen him. One, as Mrs. Edmonds tells of seeing the apparition of a small, bald man in an old-fashioned frock coat. This certainly sounds like Mackenzie. Although in life, he usually wore a red wig. Perhaps he has misled it into the next world. Or maybe he has become less vain about his appearance. Mackenzie published a small newspaper, and the press on which he printed it is still in the cellar. It is kept locked, but many staff members swear that they have heard rumbling below the sound, suspiciously like an old-time printing press going full tilt. Another ghost, more belligerent toward the living than Mackenzie, is that of a woman. Mrs. Edmonds has had her problems with this one. She tells of an awakening at night to see a woman with dark brown hair and a narrow face, leaning over and staring at her intently. A few months later, Mrs. Edmonds awoke again to see the ghostly woman. This time, the ghost struck her in the face, giving her a black eye. The Edmonds children keep seeing the ghost of a woman in the bathroom, a ghost that disappears on being sighted. Plants in the house are often watered mysteriously, and sometimes carelessly. The curtains are splashed with mud. It's not on record exactly how long the Edmonds put up with these shenanigans before moving out. However, troubles may have been reported that the toilets flush by themselves, and that water taps turn on when there was no one alive around to do this. A caretaker named Mrs. McClary says she often feels as though a ghost is putting its arms around her. However, since the spirit remains invisible, it's anyone's guess whatever it's Mackenzie or the lady ghost. Whenever renovation work is done at the house, workmen come up with a whole new batch of new floors for the place. Often objects such as sawhorses, ropes, and drop sheets are found in the morning to have been moved around, even though the building had been locked all night. And one workman, Murdo MacDonald, into the house one morning and found a hangman's noose over the stairway. It's no wonder that the Mackenzie house is one of my favorite stops on Halloween. Go check it out. Ghost tours in Toronto. Black Horse of Sutton. There are stories of phantom horses from all around the world. Usually, these horses are white or black. Sometimes they are never seen, only the clatter of their hooves, along with the rattle of spurs and the smart crack of the whip in the ghostly rider's hands. The horses gallop through history carrying important messages to kings and generals or their ladies. The Black Horse of Sutton is unique in that it appeared only to a humble woman, old Miss Sutton. She and her husband had established a homestead in the bushlands outside the town of Goulburn in the New South Wales, Australia. It was an isolated place, removed many miles from the nearest human settlement. In that general area, it was known as the Sutton Homestead, or just plain Sutton. One spring day, Mr. Sutton had to ride into Goulburn to negotiate a land deal. He left Miss Sutton behind on the lonely homestead, promising to return as soon as possible. Those were the days when there were a few roads, transportation departed on the horse. Even the mail might take a month or more to arrive. Mrs. Sutton knew she might have a long wait before her. Day by day, she waited eagerly for her husband's return. She had no way of knowing when he would be back, except by the sound of the hoofbeats of the returning horse. So one evening, a week after he left, when she heard the distant of galloping hoofs, her heart leapt with happiness. She was sure that her husband was at last on his way home. Closer and closer came the hoofs. They stopped at the outer gate. She heard the horse turning as if the rider were closing the gate behind him. Then came the click of the gate as it closed. Now the thundering hoofbeats were galloping down the drive and around the corner of the house. Suddenly, a magnificent black stallion came into view, but to Mrs. Sutton's horror, it was riderless. On hooves that had hammered out a sadistic beat, the horse galloped directly towards the shuddering woman. She cried out, terrified, but at the last minute the great beast shied away from her and trampled into the house, where it disappeared. The hoofbeats echoed in the ranges of distant mountains, fainter and fainter. They sounded until finally they disappeared altogether. The next day a messenger arrived to tell Mrs. Sutton that on his way home the evening before, her husband had been thrown by his plodding farm horse. He had been found laying dead on the side of the road while the horse grazed quietly nearby. Had the black stallion not been riderless after all? Was the soul of Mr. Sutton astride the horse, invisible but still present, as he rode home for the last time, twice more? The spectre horse appeared to Mrs. Sutton. Once it came to announce the death of her elder son, killed in the Boer War in South Africa. Later it came to tell her of her younger son's accidental death. When old Mrs. Sutton died, the homestead she and her husband loved so much was demolished. Progress transformed into a hamlet of small homes. Fine roads and automobiles linked the inhabitants to the outside world. And the black horse of Sutton gallops no more. The dog who was scared to death by a ghost. They called him Chief because he had once been owned by the police. He belonged to the Onassis family, who owned a restaurant in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania. The building had been an old farmhouse built 250 years before, and they were rebuilding the old place. As often happens when buildings are changed, it stirs up ghosts. They don't like changes. There was one frightening spirit. It threw vases and flashlights on and off, and sometimes it appeared as a grayish form hovering over people in bed. But the living being that was most frightened by this ghost was Chief. Jerry Onassis had bought the dog from the police department in nearby Upper Darby. Chief's days were numbered. Jerry had heard because Chief was so vicious and aggressive that he could not be controlled. The police were going to have to, as they put it, terminate him. Jerry figured that Chief would be perfect to have around the house, to guard it while it was being renovated. However, Jerry says the dog turned into a wimp as soon as he got here. There was something around here that would cause him to creep around and cower in the corners. One of the Onassis sons, Rick, was living in the building, and Chief would constantly stay close by him. One night, however, Rick was away, and the dog had to stay in the building by himself. Another son, Rob, arrived in the morning to do some work and found Chief obviously terrified. The dog was always freaked out here from the moment we got him, Rob says. He would completely shy away from certain areas of the building, and he would stay away from the third floor. The third floor, called the loft, was being restored as living quarters for some of the family. When Rob arrived in the morning, the dog followed him around, staying as close as possible. He was really pulling around me, Rob says. After a while, I had to go up to the loft. I couldn't see. He want to be alone, so he finally followed me up the stairs. When we got up there, he started working on a bookcase at one of the end of the long rooms. The dog was acting very strange. He would freeze, just stand stiffly and stare. You would think that somebody else was in the room. And the dog started flinching. It was as though somebody was doing something to him. It was like threatening. It was like something was standing next to him and threatening to hit him with a stick or poking him. The dog started howling and looking around wildly. He saw an open window and just dove through it. It was 3 stories above the ground. He was killed, of course. And, says Jerry on the seat, this was a dog who was so fierce that the police were going to shoot it. Can a doll haunt a house? Take Robert, a large doll that for many years inhabited the Artist House in Key West, an island off southern tip of Florida. The Artist House is a bed and breakfast establishment, a place to relax, but some patrons had anything but relaxing times there. The owner, Ed Cox, tells a young German woman who stayed in the front bedroom and who was terrified. The more you go upstairs, the staircase, the worse the feeling is. The front bedroom was the place where the doll had been kept for many years. A plumber working at the Artist House insisted that he heard the doll giggle, that he found it sitting in a different spot when no one was around to move it. Did it move itself? Owner Cox tells other distributors in the house of pictures that fly off walls, for example. He once saw the door of a book cabinet spring open for no visible reason. Sometimes doors would open. Sometimes they open when they shouldn't. Who is Robert, and what could he be up to? Robert was the doll of Robert Jean Otto, an artist who lived in the house all his life. When Jean, as he was called, was given the doll, he was 5 years old. It was custom around 1900 to give a child a doll that looked like him. Robert the doll is the size of a child. He has human hair and buttons for eyes. Jean used to dress the doll in his own clothes. He also gave it his first name, Mert Reuter, who owned the house after Jean died, cared for Robert as though he were a human being. It has different kind of clothes, she said. It was a pixie outfit that I got him. Now I have Jean's little sailor suit on him. I've been told, she said, that when Jean did anything mean or hateful, he always blamed it on the doll. Mert Reuter tells of renting the house to a law student one winter. She says, he told the story that the doll was voodoo and it locked him up in the attic. Was that true? Possibly. But it is a fact that many people have reported strange experiences in this house, whether or not Robert was causing them. Anita Hoffman, who has written books about the Hawaiian mystical tradition, Huna, suspects that what was going on with Robert is what the Hawaiians called Mona. Mona, she says, carries ideas. They can be stowed in certain things, wood and silk in particular. It flows in ways that are hard for us to understand. The doll has possibly been infected by the atmosphere of the house. Jean had been a bad-tempered person all his life. The doll had been his mirror image. A lot of his personality had gone into the doll. All the evil thoughts and actions. Possibly, Jean's anger is living on after his death through Robert.